True crime. Covenant school records fight. The file Nashville could not close. The legal fight. Over what the public can see. The file did not look like a courtroom question at first. It was a police file. A set of search materials. Writings, summaries, videos, timelines, maps, and records gathered after a school attack in Nashville. Some of it sat inside law enforcement custody. Some of it moved into sealed court filings. Some of it leaked before any judge had settled what the public could see. The object at the center kept changing. To grieving families, it was not a neutral record. It was a voice they believed should not be amplified. To public records requesters, it was government material held by a public agency after an event that demanded public scrutiny. To the courts, it became something narrower and harder, a dispute over what Tennessee law actually allows. The question was never only whether the writings should be read. It was whether a public agency could keep an entire investigative file closed because parts of it were painful, dangerous, copyrighted, security sensitive, or still tied to a criminal inquiry. That made the Covenant school records fight different from an ordinary open records lawsuit. It was not just a battle over pages. It was a battle over what should happen when public transparency collides with victim privacy, school safety, copycat fears, and the legal limits of secrecy. The life before the file. Before the public knew about motions, exemptions, and appellate rulings, the Covenant School was a private Christian school in Nashville tied to Covenant Presbyterian Church. Its identity in the court record is not abstract. The church and school shared facilities, people, and security concerns that mattered later, because the fight over disclosure was partly a fight over whether records in a police file could expose private school security information. The 6 people killed on March 27, 2023, were Evelyn D. Eckhouse, Hallie Scruggs, William Kinney, Cynthia Peake, Catherine Coonson, and Mike Hill. 3 were children, all 9 years old. 3 were adults connected to the school community. Their names became part of a public record. But the court fight that followed was driven in large part by the families and surviving children who did not want the attackers' writings turned into a public object. The available official material gives more detail about the case machinery than about the private lives interrupted by it. That imbalance is itself part of the story. Public records can show times, filings, tactical movement, legal positions, and agency decisions. They rarely show the full private shape of a school day, a family routine, or the ordinary life that existed before a public tragedy took over the record. That is why the file became so contested. For some, it promised answers. For others, it threatened repetition, fixation, and renewed harm. The people around the fight. The records fight drew in groups with sharply different interests. Metro Nashville held the records. Public records requesters sought access. The school, the church, and Covenant parents intervened to oppose release or limit it. The Tennessee Court of Appeals later described the case as beginning with several public records requests after the shooting, followed by denials, consolidated petitions, and intervention by the school, church, and parents of surviving children. The parents' position was not simply privacy in the ordinary sense. Court records show they argued that releasing writings likely to inspire future attacks should not happen, and that the children and families had rights against additional harm. The school and church also raised security arguments, warning that some material could expose safety systems, internal plans, or sensitive information about people connected to the school. The requesters saw the matter differently. Their argument was rooted in the Tennessee Public Records Act. They contended that the records were held by a public agency, that broad secrecy was not justified, and that redaction could protect truly exempt material without closing the entire file. The appellate court later took that distinction seriously. A record can contain exempt information without becoming wholly exempt. The supporting cast in the lawsuit, therefore, was not divided into heroes and villains. It was divided by what each side believed the law was designed to protect. One side feared amplification. The other feared government opacity. The first cracks The first simple explanation for withholding the records was that the investigation was still active. That mattered because, in the immediate aftermath, police were not only reconstructing the attack, they were also examining whether anyone else had provided assistance, support, weapons help, inside information, or after-the-fact concealment. Metro argued in 2023 that an ongoing criminal investigation justified denying access to the records. The first Court of Appeals decision, issued in November 2023, allowed the school, church, and parents to remain in the public records case before the disclosure question was decided. That intervention ruling changed the shape of the case. The lawsuit was no longer only requesters versus a government records custodian. It now included private parties, arguing that the records implicated their own safety, privacy, trauma, and rights. The early legal crack was procedural, but powerful. If families and institutions could intervene in a public records case, then the court had to hear arguments beyond the custodian's own reasons for denial. That gave the case a wider frame, not just whether Metro could withhold records, but whether those most affected by the shooting could help define what disclosure would mean. What began as a records request was already becoming a test case. The last ordinary movements. The police summary later fixed the morning into a tight chronology. It said Hale left home at about 8 a.m. on March 27, 2023, carrying a large duffel bag with firearms, ammunition, tactical gear, and other items, along with a backpack containing notebooks and assorted material. The summary said Hale went first to a range parking lot, remained there for more than an hour, then drove to the Covenant Presbyterian Church and School, arriving at about 9:53 a.m. The report states that Hale waited in the vehicle for several minutes, sent a goodbye message to a friend through Instagram Messenger, then exited with 2 firearms slung around the neck and shoulders. At about 10:10 a.m., Hale fired through glass doors and entered the building. The summary identifies 3 firearms carried at that stage: a Lead Star Grunt 15 AR-style pistol, a Kel-Tec Sub 2000 carbine, and a Smith & Wesson handgun. That official chronology matters here, not to restage suffering, but to explain why the records became so valuable and so disturbing. The file did not contain only legal labels. It contained the timeline, the writings, the planning materials, the digital trail, and the investigative basis for the official conclusions. The same materials that could help the public understand the attack were the materials families feared could preserve the attacker's voice. The first alarm. The first public alarm was the attack itself. The second was the uncertainty that followed. The police summary says Hale entered through shattered glass, encountered custodian Michael Hill, and fired at him. It also says smoke from the gunfire triggered a smoke detector, setting off the building's audible fire alarm, and affecting door locks under fire code requirements. Students and staff then began responding to what sounded like a fire alarm before the situation was understood as an active killer event. The file therefore carried 2 kinds of public interest. The first was investigative. What happened? When? And why? The second was institutional. What did the response show about school security, emergency systems, law enforcement action, and prevention? Those questions are not identical to curiosity about a killer's writings. A community may have a legitimate interest in understanding safety failures, police response, warning signs, and investigative conclusions without needing every personal page amplified. That distinction became central later. Even if public debate often flattened it into one question: release the manifesto or hide the manifesto. The record itself was more complicated. According to MNPD, there was no single manifesto that answered everything. The search for an explanation. The word manifesto became one of the most misleading shortcuts in the case. MNPD's final investigative summary says a manifesto, by definition, would be a single document setting out guiding principles and intentions. The summary states that, in this case, no single manifesto existed. Instead, investigators found notebooks, art composition books, and media files that documented planning, preparation, motivating events, and desired outcomes. The report said the answer was scattered across assembled material, not contained in one document. That distinction matters, because a single manifesto suggests a clean key. A scattered archive suggests something more difficult: fragments, contradictions, years of writing, selected targets, mental health history, grievance, fixation, planning, and fantasy. The public wanted motive. The families feared notoriety. Courts had to decide access. Police had to separate what the documents showed from what they did not show. The search for explanation was therefore not only psychological, it became legal. Could Tennessee's public records law force access to material that might be disturbing, dangerous, or copyrighted? Could a school safety exception cover the entire archive? Could victims' rights stop disclosure? Could copyright turn public records into private material? The file became the answer everyone wanted, and the object many people wanted contained the evidence that did not fit. By 2024, the legal arguments had multiplied. The trial court held a show cause hearing in April 2024 and entered a final order on July 4, 2024. The Court of Appeals later summarized that order. The trial court concluded Metro's file was totally exempt from disclosure, accepted Rule 16 arguments tied to an ongoing investigation, found the school security exception covered the writings and compilations, and concluded that federal copyright law conflicted with state public records law. The copyright argument had an unusual path. Court records say the shooter's surviving parents filed notice that they had assigned rights in the writings to another party. The transfer was described as a gift to parents in trust for the benefit of covenant children, with the stated purpose of preventing dissemination and harm. That move changed the case's legal texture. Copyright is usually discussed in the language of ownership, copying, distribution, display, and infringement. Here, it was being used as a shield against public access to a mass attacker's writings held inside a government investigative file. For families, the logic was protective. For requesters, it was alarming. If copyright could block inspection of public records, then any copyrighted material held by government could become harder to scrutinize. The records fight had moved beyond one school. It was now testing the boundary between intellectual property and public oversight. The event at the center of the case. The central event in the records fight was not only the attack. It was the moment the courts had to translate horror into law. The trial court's 2024 ruling favored broad withholding. The appellate court's 2026 ruling narrowed the frame. It did not treat family pain as imaginary. It did not say every page must be handed out without protection. It did not say school security information could never be redacted. What it rejected was the leap from real harm and real sensitivity to blanket secrecy. The Court of Appeals said the Tennessee Public Records Act exists to provide a tool for citizens to hold government agencies accountable. It held that the school safety exception was not a blanket school shooter manifesto exception, and that exempt school security information should be redacted rather than used to close every responsive record. The court also separated inspection from reproduction. It reasoned that Metro could allow personal inspection of records without itself copying, publishing, or publicly displaying copyrighted material. The court left harder questions about copying and possible copyright liability for later disputes, but it rejected copyright as a total barrier to inspection. That distinction was the legal hinge. The court did not say copyright was meaningless. It said copyright did not automatically create secrecy around government-held records. The file could be painful and still public. It could contain redactions and still be inspectable. It could be copyrighted and still not vanish from the public record system. When the story broke open. The story broke open in stages, not all of them orderly. Some material reached the public through leaks before the courts had completed the disclosure fight. Other material later appeared through a separate federal release. The FBI Vault page now lists multiple Covenant school shooting files, showing that federal records connected to the case moved through a separate disclosure channel from Metro's Tennessee public records dispute. The leak issue added another layer. It meant the public debate was no longer only about whether records should be released through lawful review. It also became about whether restricted investigative material had been removed, copied, or provided outside the process. In May 2025, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation announced 2 indictments against former Metro Nashville Police Lieutenant Garrett Davidson. TBI said agents began investigating at the request of the District Attorney General, alleged Davidson used his position to access restricted areas, and said 1 indictment charged theft, burglary, and official misconduct, while the second charged 6 counts of official misconduct related to the Covenant School shooting. TBI emphasized that the charges were accusations, and that Davidson was presumed innocent unless proven guilty through due process. That mattered because it separated lawful transparency from uncontrolled disclosure. A court-supervised records process can redact, sequence, and define access. A leak cannot. The case built from fragments. The strongest version of the transparency argument was not that every reader needed every disturbing page. It was that public agencies should not be able to avoid scrutiny by invoking broad categories without document-by-document justification. The strongest version of the family argument was not that the public had no interest. It was that some material may create real risks, re-traumatization, copycat attention, school security exposure, and the preservation of an attacker's intended notoriety. Court records show parents specifically argued against releasing writings and materials likely to inspire future attacks, or give the shooter a continuing voice over victims and survivors. The appellate ruling tried to force precision. A school security exemption may protect actual security information. It does not automatically cover every writing, drawing, or compilation, because the writer later attacked a school. Victims' rights matter. But the appellate court affirmed that the Tennessee constitutional and statutory victim rights provisions cited did not themselves bar disclosure of public records in the case. The legal question was not whether the writings were morally valuable. It was whether Tennessee law allowed a public agency to withhold them entirely. That is the part casual summaries often miss. Public records law is not an applause meter. It does not ask whether a record is admirable, ugly, painful, or socially corrosive. It asks whether the record is public, whether an exemption applies, and whether redaction can protect what the law actually protects. The outcome that did not end the story. On February 4, 2026, the Court of Appeals of Tennessee issued its decision. The court affirmed in part, reversed in part, and remanded the case. It affirmed the intervening parent's standing to raise copyright arguments, and affirmed that the victim rights provisions cited did not bar disclosure. On all other issues, it reversed the trial court. That was a major shift, but not a clean ending. The appellate decision sent the case back for further proceedings. It required a narrower approach than the trial court's broad closure. It pointed toward access, redaction, and inspection, rather than total withholding. The court's copyright reasoning was especially important. It said Metro's obligation could be satisfied by allowing personal inspection, and it did not decide whether requesters should copy or reproduce the records after inspection. That left a practical tension. Inspection may be required, but what happens next could still raise copyright questions. The ruling also left the school security issue alive in a narrower form. If specific passages reveal internal safety measures, plans, or protected security details, those details may still be redacted. The court's rejection was of a blanket exception, not of every possible protection. The outcome did not close the file. It changed the rules for opening it. The aftermath, people still argue about. The aftermath split into 2 debates. The first debate is about the Covenant file itself. How much of it should be inspected? How much should be redacted? And whether publication or copying should carry separate legal risk. The second debate is broader. Whether mass attackers' writings should be treated differently from other public records because of the risk of imitation and notoriety. MNPD's final investigative summary sharpened that second debate. The report said the investigation found no evidence anyone other than Hale took part in planning, preparation, or execution of the murders. No evidence anyone aided Hale afterward. And no information or evidence suggesting any living person was criminally culpable. It said the case was being cleared by exception, because the only chargeable offender was deceased. That official conclusion reduced the force of one early reason for withholding: the unresolved possibility of criminal charges against others. But it did not erase every privacy, copyright, school security, or copycat concern. The motive question also became more precise. MNPD's summary said the determined motive was notoriety, while also describing other factors that fueled Hale's depression and resentment. It stated that no single document contained the whole answer. That finding makes unrestricted amplification especially fraught, because notoriety was not incidental to the case. According to investigators, it was central. That is the hard part. Transparency can expose official truth. It can also deliver the attention an attacker sought. The review, appeal, or unanswered question. As of July 5, 2026, the latest confirmed public legal posture found for this article is February 4, 2026 appellate ruling and remand. The appellate court's decision did not function as a simple public download order. It sent the case back with instructions that require a more careful process than the trial court used. The unresolved question is practical as much as legal. What does meaningful access look like when the records include writings, security-sensitive information, minors' privacy concerns, and potential copyright claims? A page-by-page review is slow, but it is the method the law prefers when a file contains both public and protected material. It prevents one sensitive page from burying hundreds of inspectable pages. It also prevents transparency from becoming reckless dumping. This is where the Covenant records fight becomes bigger than Nashville. Future cases may involve police files containing attacker writings, school maps, digital research, videos, private messages, therapy-adjacent material, social media archives, or copyrighted personal documents. Courts will need tools more precise than total secrecy or total exposure. The Covenant case did not remove that tension. It made the tension visible. Why this case still matters. The Covenant school records fight matters because it sits at the edge of two truths that do not cancel each other out. The public has a legitimate interest in understanding how a mass attack was planned, how warnings were missed or interpreted, how law enforcement responded, how agencies handled evidence, and how officials reached their conclusions. Public records law exists because government files can reveal what official summaries soften or omit. Families and survivors also have a legitimate interest in not seeing a killer's words turned into a trophy, script, brand, or roadmap. Some records do not merely inform. They can wound, instruct, attract, or preserve the very attention an attacker wanted. The appellate decision tried to make the law do what public argument often cannot: separate categories. Inspectable does not mean unredacted. Copyrighted does not mean secret. Painful does not mean exempt. Public does not mean harmless. A record can carry all of those qualities at once. The file that began as evidence became a legal mirror. It showed Tennessee a question that every future records fight will have to face. When a public file contains private devastation, how much secrecy can the law tolerate, and how much exposure can a community survive?